Speaking of leadership, we're going to turn to the four women that we're going to have here who are going to share with us some of what they brought to the question of leadership in their battles. So welcome to our Mothers Out Front webinar on how Texas moms took on the fracking industry and won. I'm going to welcome you as our webinar's moderator. My name's Melissa Ludke, and I'm a member of Mothers Out Front team that tracks health impacts connected with the fossil fuel industry. And then we work with Mothers Out Front organizers in different chapters in different states to make this information accessible and useful for campaigns. So tonight we're in for a treat because we're going to be able to hear from four tenacious moms who are going to share their stories of what goes on in creating a campaign that is capable of taking on the very powerful fracking industry in Texas. After that, we're going to have some time for questions. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. Please put your questions in the chat as we go along, and we will turn to them when our session with the four women concludes, and we'll get to them then. Also, I'd ask all of you to please mute yourself at this point so we don't have any background noise that interferes with hearing the speakers. And just know that during this webinar, I'm going to occasionally share my screen to try to show some visuals while the speakers are talking. All of this, of course, is open to technical error or mistake, so bear with us. We'll do the best we can in this. So let's get started. I'm going to start by, I'm going to introduce each of the speakers as I turn to them with some prompting questions. I'm going to turn first of all to Ranjana Bhandari. She's the founder of Liveable Arlington, and I'm going to ask her to set the scene for us. Talk about what it was like as you and other community members in Arlington prepared to go before your city council with a request for them to stop the siting of several hydraulic fracturing drilling sites that turned out to be in close proximity to an early learning center that was serving primarily minority children in a part of the city that is experiencing the greatest rate of COVID-19 infections. So as you begin, I'm going to share some photos that you shared with me of the proximity of these drilling sites near homes and areas in your town. So Ranjana, please begin, and I'll share some of these as you're speaking. Thank you.
Good evening, Melissa. Hello, everybody. So just a bit of background. Arlington lies on top of the Barnett Shale in Texas, and urban drilling arrived here a dozen years ago with false promises of complete safety, zero health risks, and mailbox money every month. The drillers came here armed with propaganda and having already recruited political and faith leaders and national environmental groups as supporters. People very quickly leased to drillers, and within a pretty short span of time, we found ourselves with close to 60 large drill sites and now 350 plus gas wells in our 99 square miles with 380,000 residents. We experienced firsthand the risks, the health issues as drilling continues to expand. And most of this drilling was permitted with city council votes that took a few minutes with a very short, minimal public hearing. So our effort at Liveable Arlington has been focused on making sure that the community is at these public hearings, that all relevant issues and concerns are aired and get a hearing on the record. So in this last vote last month, we had Total, a French energy giant that wanted to drill in a neighborhood which has a very large Black and Latino population, 1 in 4 households living in poverty, and it's been hit pretty hard by the COVID pandemic. So we used the best available peer-reviewed research. We made that research easy to access and understand, and we fanned out through the impacted community and made sure that people knew about the drilling plans, the possible effect the drilling would have on their families, and ways in which they could oppose the permitting of these wells. We reached out to neighborhood leaders who were already organizing in the neighborhood on other issues. We reached out to other local allies to get legal and technical help. And we became the hub of the resistance. And we made sure that all these important issues were aired at the hearing. In fact, our group has been so successful in bringing the public, local physicians, scientists, mothers, and neighbors to hearings that now our city council has made plans to try and permit wells without holding public hearings, unfortunately.
Thank you so much. Let me turn to this. You talked about drilling first arriving in Arlington, and you've mentioned that there were really no studies at that point that established whether fracking was safe and very little research about its health effects. But certainly over time, as you mentioned, that's changed. And today there are really thousands of peer-reviewed studies pointing to a multitude of health effects, including respiratory, heart disease, asthma, preterm births, low birth weight babies. Can you tell us a little bit how, as an organizer, you rely on those health impact studies about fracking to create the multiracial coalition that you brought to be up against this powerful industry in Texas? Can you talk a little bit about what role those health impact studies played in your organization, in your organizing?
Okay. So the scientific research that's available motivates families, mothers especially, to act when they understand the risks to their children. The research also gives us credibility as an environmental group because our advocacy and our opposition is based on good peer-reviewed science. It also gives our campaigns credibility with the media. And then comes the really hard part. The science exists, but politicians don't act on it. It puts politicians who have the power to decide in a tough spot. Many of them practice science denial, or at the very least, uncertainty. They latch on to the uncertainty sometimes that exists in the studies. But this puts them at odds with affected families who live in their districts. So they have to balance that with their fealty to the industry, and they have to make a political calculation. My job as an organizer is to change the balance of that political calculation. So for example, this last campaign that we ran was a textbook study on how to leverage the science to get a decision that protects the health of our community. So to do that, we armed affected residents with the best science, and we put them in the same room with these voting politicians and hope that the rest of the community and the media are watching that interaction. So in order to do that, we met the neighbors, we met the leaders and organizers who are already here in our community, working on these issues, working on other issues. And we worked along with them to meet hundreds of residents to share the science. We distilled it into easy terms in both English and Spanish. We told people how to participate in the hearing, and we encouraged them to reach out to their elected leaders. We tabled at St. Matthew's Church. We tabled at the preschool Mother's Heart. We knocked on doors. We left flyers at apartment complexes in the neighborhood about what the science was saying about how this would harm neighbors, especially children. And we mentioned how drilling is polluting and how that pollution is linked to diseases, especially childhood asthma, because we discovered that most families there are dealing with childhood asthma. There's a very high incidence of that. We also encouraged the impacted neighbors to be front and center at the hearing, speaking to the harms of drilling. Science points to harms in the abstract, and we had to make that harm concrete by empowering the neighbors to join in and speak about how this would hurt them. So, the pages of the scientific journals, which I actually like to read, had to be transposed into this powerful image of an affected mother or the director of the preschool, asking our political leaders for safety for their children. So in some sense, this was truly an exercise in democracy. Citizens armed with facts and knowledge and the best public health research speaking truth to power. And this is our struggle now in America with issues bigger than urban drilling, things like pandemic denial and the climate crisis.
It absolutely is, and you said it beautifully and tied it in. And so now we're going to turn to a person who we're just really honored has joined us tonight, and someone who made a trip to Arlington to talk about the research in this and informed a lot of people in those communities about it. Dr. Ann Epstein, who's an internal medicine physician in Lubbock, Texas. You know, aside from her own clinical practice, she researches the health impacts of the oil and gas development. And then she shares what she's learned with community members so that, you know, the actions taken in places like Arlington can be informed by what the experts have learned about the health impacts. But Dr. Epstein, it's not often that an internal medicine doctor in Texas decides that they're going to spend their quote unquote free time studying the health impacts of an industry that's pretty powerful and most people don't feel can be sort of tinkered with. So can you describe for us how you first got involved in even digging into the health impacts of fracking? What compelled you to do this?
Oh, thank you. Well, I was a member of the Lubbock Board of Health, which is a citizens advisory committee. I was appointed by city council, and this is a voluntary association, and we're supposed to advise city council on all things related to health. Well, when I was a member of the board, a concerned citizens group came to us because there had been a request for a fracking permit in Lubbock, and they had complained to city council and had been brushed off. So they came to the Board of Health because we had a reputation for activism because of a previous campaign. And so I, you know, sure, I said, I'll do it, you know, so I volunteered. Yes. So I volunteered to research it. And it was much more involved than I thought it was going to be. But at that time, I found, this is fairly early on, I found that there was enough evidence of harm that to recommend changes to our oil and gas ordinance. You know, all cities in Texas have this. And so I managed to made some presentations to our board. They agreed with some pushback. And then I presented this to city council. And because of our status as a city board, we got this, you know, a block for presentation to city council. So we came at it from the board point of view. And once again, the city council was interested, but they decided to form an oil and gas committee, and they put me on it, on this standing advisory committee. And of course, it was packed with industry representatives. And so I was a member of that committee, and that was kind of tough going, I'll tell you. And I actually did team up with a local environmental group for some moral and strategic support, which turned out to be very helpful. And eventually, there were some contentious presentations to city council, made another presentation to city council, was insulted by the mayor in public and on TV, got a lot of people mad. And eventually, city council did vote in favor of one of our key recommendations, which was to increase setbacks from 300 to 600 feet, which is already nothing. Unfortunately, about 2 weeks later, Texas passed House Bill 40, which effectively nullified local control. But there I was already.
About that, yeah, we'll get to Texas Bill 40 in just a bit, but I want to get to some of the key health impacts you found, and working with me in terms of getting ready for this webinar, you've identified, we can't talk about all of them. So I'm going to put a slide up and encourage you to talk a little bit about the what you've discovered in terms of some of the key health impacts that you're sharing with people. So let me put this slide up and go to it.
Okay, well, this was a very important slide that I shared with the people in Arlington. First, you should understand that fracking can cause air pollution with toxic chemicals. And one of the worst is benzene, which is a known cause of leukemia and blood disease. The closer people live to fracking operations and the more fracking they're exposed to, the greater the danger. And this study, there had been a number of studies that were showing elevated benzene levels, but you know, for some reason, various regulators were not convinced, even though it was clearly convincing stuff. So finally, one of the most prominent researcher on this was Lisa McKenzie, who just did a bunch of outstanding studies, and she's in Colorado and really called attention to Colorado for this. So in this slide, this shows a study where the state of Colorado got so serious about this that they did their own study. And that's very important because this is the kind of study they do in order to prepare for setting new regulations. And what they did was they measured, as you can see from this slide, they actually measured 47 different chemicals that these wells put out in the air. And they measured them at different distances. The question was, what should the setbacks be? In other words, how far away can you safely drill? What are the levels of these chemicals? So they measured the chemicals and used modeling techniques to try to predict the likelihood of getting sick from the chemicals. And to no one's surprise, they found this high amounts of benzene, which was terrible stuff, and they calculated the risk of harm from benzene. And they did this at a variety of different distances, and what they called the worst case scenario, that is the highest risk people. And they had a number of cases that made it worst case scenario. They found that benzene increased the risk of cancer up to 2,000 feet away. So if you live within 2,000 feet of a well, the levels of benzene can be predicted to be high enough to cause cancer in the worst cases. Now, they also looked at an average case, and at average cases, it clearly increased the risk of cancer up to about 1,000 to 1,200 feet. But you should also know that it underestimated the cancer risk because they only did one chemical at a time, and they didn't calculate the risk of many of the other air toxins that were there. So this is a critical study clearly demonstrating increased risk due to benzene exposure.
Let's go on to, I want to go on because we're going to come back to the other study that you have and we can catch up on that. But okay. I really want to tie into your work and what you're discovering here to the work that's in what's happened in Arlington, because you decided not only to do this work because of the position you found yourself in at Lubbock, but you decided to take this presentation on the road, make it available across Texas to communities that were dealing with this, such as the people in Arlington. And I want to just understand from your perspective, you've got a thriving medical practice. You already are serving on boards in your own community, and you're going to take yourself out on the road and do this. Can you just give us a little understanding of kind of, again, what compelled you to do that? And then we'll come back to one other study that you can talk about in some depth as well.
Well, presenting the information to City Council and dealing with the industry hostility was quite an eye-opener. I discovered that there was a lot of misinformation about the health effects of fracking coming from industry, and that industry was representing themselves as the scientists, and everybody else, was nothing. And so they were really trying to silence the voice of other scientists. And they were claiming that fracking was completely safe. They were using unfair and misleading tactics. They put me up on one of their websites as, somebody that we need to watch, watch out for this person. They criticized me in print. I was really mad about that. And this was really the worst of science denial. So I realized that there was a need for a voice of an expert, somebody who could select and assemble high quality scientific data and present it in a clear way so the public could see how strong the evidence really was. typically there would be newspaper articles, and every time a study came out, there would be public acknowledgement, but nobody seemed to be putting it together and saying, look, there's this tremendous body of evidence, and here's what it means. And so I found that my role seemed to be a useful one. This was something I could do to help. And my work on the board showed me that it was really an important project. So I did this to help communities so that they could place their response to industry on a firm scientific foundation, and they could be more effective in persuading local governments and regulators, and that they could respond to industry and their bad behavior and misinformation that they were giving in public.
Terrific, thank you. I'm going to put up the other slide that you had, and the reason that we picked this one together is because the emphasis in Arlington in terms of what they brought to the city council was looking at the health impacts on children, in particular because the drilling sites that were in question here were going to be just about a few feet over the setback limit of 600 feet, which is what Arlington has by its city ordinances. So I wanted you to talk a little bit with your expertise from your research on the particular impacts on the health of children from the siting of these in close proximity. So let me go and share my screen again as you begin to talk about this, particularly with an emphasis, I believe, on asthma.
Okay. Well, first thing to realize is that there are a number of high quality scientific studies that demonstrate that fracking causes harm to human health, that this is not a dubious project. And I wanted to present here a very important study about the effects of asthma. Hold on a second. About the effects of asthma. This is a very high quality study published in the medical journal JAMA that many people have heard of. So this was not something that industry could say was not a high quality study. And what it showed was a study of people with asthma and asked, if you lived close to a well, what was your chance of having an asthma attack? So they did this very complex, careful study looking at asthma patients and correlating, discovering how close each one of these people lived to a well the day before their asthma attack, and asked if they were living close to wells, especially close to a whole bunch of wells, what were the chances that they would have an asthma attack compared to people who didn't live close to a well. And so this study showed that asthma patients who lived in the midst of the densest well development and very close to wells had over a 1.5 to 4.5 times greater odds of having an asthma attack if they lived close to wells.
Wow.
And this was very significant. That's a big number by medical standards. And this was very significant. They had 12 different categories, and for 11 out of 12, it was very significant, which is a big medical result. And the greater the exposure, the greater the likelihood of an asthma attack. So they adjusted for multiple factors. So it wasn't something else causing asthma. For example, it wasn't just that the parents smoked in the house. You know, that's another frequent cause. Mm-hmm. So this type of study clearly demonstrates an association that wells, people who live in the midst of oil and gas wells, have a higher risk of asthma.
Thank you so much. No.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that I wanted to sort of come back. We're going to come back to you as we get toward the end of this presentation to talk about the distance that these wells have to be in order to mitigate against some of these health impacts. And I noticed that I don't think Wanda's with us. Is that right, Ranjana? Ranjana? I don't see her with us.
So I'm surprised. I thought she would be here.
Okay, well, I'm going to now, if I can, Dr. Epstein, just talk a little bit about the situation in Arlington through the eyes of Wanda Vincent, who's the founder and the owner of something called the Mother's Heart Learning Center. Wanda was going to visit us, but I'm going to try to tell her story. If she comes in, then we will have it. And then I'm going to turn to Maria to follow up more on this. But Wanda Vincent really was at the heart of this story in the sense that her Mother's Heart Learning Center, I'm going to show you on a map how close it was to the proposed well site. You will see here the drilling area that we're talking about in this case, that they went to the city council to try to stop the drilling and succeeded. You're going to see here is the Mother's Heart Learning Center. Mother's Heart Learning Center, founded 17 years ago by Wanda Vincent, serves 102 children who range in age from 6 weeks old to 12 years old. They come from nearby neighborhoods in Arlington, and roughly they are 80% African-American children from families and Latino families, 20%. In the zip code where Mother's Heart operates and where Total wanted to put its new drilling sites, has the largest percentage of COVID-19 cases of any area in the city of Arlington. And in this area, this broader area, children's asthma rate in this county is already close to 20%, which is startlingly high. When Wanda went before the city council, one of the most powerful messages that she brought to them was really in the form of a question. She asked them, can you, as city council members, guarantee to me 100% guarantee that you will not be putting any of us, myself or these children, in harm's way now or in the future? When I asked her earlier what more did she talk about when she went before the city council, she talked about there how when in 2010 there were drilling sites also put in this same area without adequate notice to the neighbors, that she said back then, she said, we really didn't know what in the world was going on. We didn't know that we had a voice in anything. And we didn't know that it could be hazardous to us. So now, a decade later, with the announcement of these new drilling wells and the work of Liveable Arlington to do the community organizing to bring people together, Wanda Vincent, for the first time, was compelled to join this fight this time around. And I think that, Ranjana, you might want to talk about this. Her presence at that hearing, what was the significance, do you think, to have Wanda's voice in that hearing?
We've talked about the science that drives our advocacy work as Liveable Arlington. And the science exists, and it's very good, and it's compelling, as Dr. Epstein just told us. However, it's still abstract. When you appeal to politicians to make a vote, to make a decision, a hard decision based on science, they often don't do that. They have to have that science which talks about the potential harm to their constituents. They need to see a visual of it. They need to see an image of a voter, somebody who lives in the community standing up and saying, you've heard the science. So I want you to understand that if you go ahead and allow this drilling, it's going to hurt me, or it's going to hurt my children, or it's going to hurt these preschoolers in my charge. As Liveable Arlington, or as a physician, or as a community advocate, you can speak to it in the abstract, but it still does not move politicians here. So what I have learned, and what Liveable Arlington has tried very hard to do, is to work in the community, find the people who are going to be harmed, and support them so that they can be their best advocate. So we want to not speak for them. All our organizing is done with the harm that they are going to experience in mind, but we'd rather stand alongside them and behind them while they're speaking to the harms that they're going to experience. And so I think Wanda was critical because she could speak very personally about these children in her charge who were going to be hurt. I could only speak to it with studies and slides and statistics and remind them, look, there are 20% of children in Arlington who have asthma. Asthma costs $3,200 a year. It keeps kids out of school. It makes them really sick. But it's still an abstraction because I wasn't speaking about myself. And so it was really important to have her there. And we were so, so happy that she spoke. And she was a very powerful advocate for her children.
Thank you. We're going to switch now over to your great partner in organizing. Talk about an organizer. We're going to meet organizer just extraordinaire, Maria Robles. And let me do a brief introduction. She is an immigrant rights organizer who works primarily with low-income people in Catholic and Hispanic churches in Arlington. And Maria was instrumental in carrying word about this as a looming health issue to the families that she is in contact with and she serves. So Maria, I'd like you to join us now and talk a bit about what all of us are learning about health impacts and describe why you felt so compelled to bring this issue to the families that you work with. Are you on mute? I think you're on mute, Maria. Just come off of mute and we'll be all set. Okay, terrific.
Okay, well, it was very interesting to talk to Ranjana and her members at one of our meetings because we weren't sure how these issues were hurting our communities. We knew it was bad, but we didn't realize why or how it was hurting our families. And so when our families got to hearing the studies and we started to put two and two together, that's, figuring out, wait a minute, that's why our kids have so much health issues. Then a lot of the parents said, well, my kids have asthma. This one has asthma that's controlled and this one is severe. So with the studies and the personal experience that the parents were having, we started to see that these things were connected. We've always known that these are cause environmental issues and cause health issues, but we didn't have the studies to match with the families until Ranjana and her group came and talked to us at the church. And so I think it was instrumental for her to bring us those facts for us to be able to tie the two together. And of course, fighting for our families is what we do. And we got together and our efforts, thankfully, gave us a big win, but collaboratively.
Great. Now, Maria, do you think that for many of your families, this was one of the first times that they really had this kind of information really set before them and explained to them in ways that made it accessible to them, ways that they could go on and then explain it to their neighbors? And maybe you could talk a little bit about how the information came to them and how you were able and others were able to help it to be understood and then acted on. I'm going to show a few visuals while you talk, so go ahead.
As always, we always feel in the organizing sector of our undocumented and mixed status families that the language is a big barrier. It's a big wall that we face when our community is trying to be kept up to date. And it was instrumental for us to be able to explain it, take the study information and make it in plain Spanish and tell people why and how this was affecting their lives. Once we were able to inform them in their language and in the words that were easily understood, people are interested. People want to live a healthy life, but a lot of the times, as with COVID, the information that the CDC, for example, had at the beginning, it wasn't in Spanish. So not that Spanish is the only language in Arlington, but it's one of the major languages that is spoken. And so I think the language barrier and being able to make that bridge was instrumental in joining this efforts.
That's terrific. Thank you for that. Maria, I'm going to just turn now to your own personal experience with this, if I might, because I understand, and I saw this in an interview you later gave to a newspaper, that an agent called a landman in Texas of the gas industry had approached your elderly mother. And this landman convinced your mother to sign away the natural gas mineral rights underneath your family's home. Recently, you were quoted as saying, "We thought we had done a lot of research, but it was not enough. We were too busy dealing with the police brutality and immigration and other issues. We had never thought about environmental issues." Please share with all of us now what you and your family now feel about that decision to accept that bonus payment and the royalty checks in return for giving the gas companies the right to drill under your home.
So we feel as we were not given the full information that we should have been offered whenever these landmen came knocking on doors. As I said, in 2010, we were fighting for immigration reform and trying to balance all the other social issues that we work with, that we thought, looking around the neighborhood and getting all the information that with the other groups, joining other groups and doing the research and having the meetings to see about the effects, we had an idea that it had a negative, some type of negative effect on the community, but not to this degree. And so ultimately, my mom signed the lease. She got a sign-on check, and then from there, it drizzled down every year. But looking back now, I think if more people had the actual facts, scientific facts, tied with the proposals, I don't think we would have signed as easily. Even though a lot of us tried to do a lot of research, there wasn't very much information, at least not in the Hispanic community, to be able to make that decision and bind together and say, no, not in our neighborhood. So I wish that I knew before that there was all these other resources. But again, you can't turn back time. So it's a lesson learned, but most definitely worth the check that they gave.
Well, hopefully your experience will teach others here tonight and in turn others around the country. But Maria, you were not the only one in your group tonight who had to make a decision about whether to permit the gas company from drilling under your home. Ranjana, you and your husband confronted this decision too, and you made a different decision. And even though you fought hard not to allow this to happen, the gas company still finally won and was able to drill under your home, and you ended up being paid nothing, despite the fact that they took the gas anyway. Can you briefly tell us about what was a very long-term and complicated effort to push back against this happening and still finding yourself losing in the end?
So the first thing I want to say is I want to echo what Maria just told us. When the landmen first arrived here about a dozen years ago, they came with very slick propaganda, and they had already enlisted our politicians, our faith leaders in this enterprise of urban drilling. And most people, when they saw who was lined up behind this, when they saw their churches signing up to become drill sites, when they saw politicians promoting it, I think there was this implicit idea that these people wouldn't allow something this toxic or this harmful to happen right in our residential community. So people consented, but that was not informed consent. That consent was based on mass deception and lies. And that's what we've learned over the last 12 years. So what I want to emphasize is there was no environmental impact study done whatsoever to prove to us that this was going to be safe. So when the landmen came to us and to our neighborhood, I started looking. I had a 5-year-old at the time, and there was no there was no research out there. But I did find one piece of information which mentioned benzene. And I looked up benzene and I realized that this was very toxic to children. So I started talking to my neighbors. Most of them were not convinced because the physician who lived on our street said, benzene is so toxic, nobody is going to allow them to emit benzene. That just can't happen. So anyway, I kept looking and eventually decided that we would not sign a lease because I was not a public advocate, but I had environmental leanings. And I remember signing a petition just a few months before where somebody, some national group, I don't remember who they were, had asked us to sign a petition to stop drilling in the Arctic because it was going to be bad for the caribou herd. And they specifically pointed to birth rates and fertility. The fear that the caribou herd, their reproduction rates would fall. So I thought, well, if it's bad for caribou babies, it must be bad for human babies. So that's where the decision was made, so to speak. And then, of course, Texas is an oil and gas state. Our politics are completely tied to the fortunes of the oil and gas industry. So we were at the end of the lateral that drilled under this part of our neighborhood. We weren't in their way, but they decided, they being Chesapeake Energy, to take us to the state agency, the Railroad Commission. And the Railroad Commission, after a sham hearing, gave them the right to drill up to our house. And that's a whole different story. But what I learned that day from that hearing was, things you couldn't unlearn. I still had some faith in how our government worked and how our politics worked and how property rights were valued, and this sort of nebulous sense that somebody out there in government was watching out for our health. And all of that was stripped away after that one day in Austin at this hearing. And so I couldn't, forget what I had seen, and eventually became a more public advocate against urban drilling, and in favor of decisions that preserve not just livable communities for our children to grow up healthy, but a livable planet so they can have the kind of quality of life that we all took for granted, but we are actively stealing from them. And part of what motivated me to create Liveable Arlington was that experience and the realization that all these decisions were being made that would impact our children the most, and our children had, and there was absolutely no one there at the decision-making table who was taking children's welfare now and in the future into account.
Thank you. We're going to turn for conclusion here back to Dr. Epstein, because one of the pieces of research that you've been working on, and we're a co-author on a major paper with Dr. Epstein, has to do with this question that we've been kind of coming around during this entire discussion. And that is this question of what is a safe setback from this industry. That is something that each community, each city makes a decision on its own about. And what we've already learned in Arlington, it's 600 feet. 20 miles down the road in Dallas, it's 1,500 feet. Your research earlier is telling us that for some of these chemicals, you're not even safe if you're within 2,000 feet. So I'd like you to very briefly talk with us about your findings in terms of what the current science says about what constitutes, if there is such a thing, as a safe setback distance from this industry. And then we're going to go to questions, because I do see the clock running, and I want to talk also, and maybe you'll be heartened by this, Dr. Epstein, because a Mothers Out Front group in California, Mothers Out Front groups are fighting hard for a bill that we're going to tell you all about that is really trying to make a difference in the setback distance in California. So let's first turn to you, Dr. Epstein, for a brief update on the current science. Then we'll go to our action and just some time for Q&A.
Okay, well, the setback question is difficult to answer precisely because health and safety often depend on how many wells you're exposed to, the density, as well as the distance. But let me bring up a topic which isn't always considered health and safety. That's the risk of explosions and blowouts.
Yep.
That's rare, but devastating when it occurs. In the Barnett Shale from 2006 to 2015, in other words, during the time of fracking, there was 16 blowouts that my colleagues found. The average evacuation area for this was 0.8 miles, average, not maximum, and displaced 49 families. In addition to that, when wells explode, they sometimes create fires, and those fires burn very hot. And one of my colleagues also analyzed this and found that at a 500-foot setback, risk of second-degree burns occurred in 30 minutes. And at 350 feet, which is greater than the Lubbock setbacks was, you could get second-degree burns in 22 seconds.
Oof.
So
Wow.
if you're thinking about, so a lot of mothers were thinking about schools and blowouts by a school. Let me point out 500 feet is too close, is clearly much too close. And considering that the average evacuation distance we found was 0.8 feet, was 0.8 miles, a reasonable school setback is probably a mile to protect from explosions and blowouts. The incidence isn't very high, but it goes up every year. The more wells you're exposed to and the longer those wells are in operation, the greater likelihood you're going to be exposed to an explosion. Now, the Colorado study that I mentioned suggested a 2,000-foot setback, and this was based on the Colorado government data. And that would sure be good. I would like to see 2,000 feet. But there's additional information as well about risk to fetuses. You know, the developing fetus is more susceptible to toxins than adults are. And there was one study showing that pregnant women who live within 1 kilometer have a significantly increased risk of a problem with pregnancy as a result of proximity to wells, such as low birth weight and preterm birth. And that as you moved out toward 3 kilometers, there was still a risk, although it was diminished. And that over 3 kilometers, there didn't seem to be a problem. So let's just say overall, I would say a 1 mile setback for schools would be great. If you're pregnant, or thinking of becoming pregnant, I'd also suggest living at least a mile from wells, possibly 2 miles, which would be the 3 kilometer distance these researchers found. However, we also found that setbacks are a political issue. And given current politics, a 1 mile for everybody from a well was probably not going to be achievable in the near future, but I could certainly support 2,000 feet. I think the 500 feet is reckless endangerment.
Thank you so much. I'm going to put up now for us while Kelsey Worth, my wonderful colleague and our co-founder of Mothers Out Front, searches through the chat and comes up with a few key questions that we can spend the last 10 minutes going after. But I want to show you what Mothers Out Front in California is working on right now. And this has to do with an assembly bill that is actually asking to establish a 2,500-foot buffer zone setback between toxic drilling and sensitive sites like homes, schools, and daycares. This bill is going to be heard by the California Senate Natural Resources Water Committee on Wednesday, August 5th. There's only one more vote, yes vote, needed to have it pass through that committee and be able to go to the legislature. So we're going to put in the chat for any of you who are interested to grab it now, the link to this action. And if you know anyone in California, please send it to them, or go ahead and tweet it out and ask for a yes vote on this to try to do, as Dr. Epstein has said, do what we know the science tells us we must, is just to separate human beings from the toxic, harmful consequences of the drilling that is moving in on many of the homes and schools and daycares like Wanda Vincent's. So Kelsey, as I come back to share so that all of us can see each other again, can you raise some of the questions for us and we can turn it over to our guest?
Absolutely. Absolutely, Melissa, thank you. So we have one question for Ranjana. You mentioned at the beginning of your remarks that the fracking companies, and maybe it was one in particular, I guess it was Total from France, but maybe there were others too involved, came in with environmental groups and faith groups already on their side. And there's a question, you know, can you say a little bit more about what those groups were and how that all happened?
Oh, so this refers to at least 12 years ago when urban drilling first became a thing here. So they enlisted a lot of local churches. Churches tend to have land here. And so a lot of drill sites were sited on the churches. And so, for instance, the leasing meetings for our neighborhood all happened on church property. And so what it did was I think, instilled this false sense of confidence in neighbors that this was probably okay. So we still have a lot of churches with preschools that have drill sites. So I think, you know, that was just clever strategy. You know, you enlist the churches, you enlist the faith leaders, and you lull people into thinking that this must be a good thing. Environmental groups at the time, there were some major national environmental groups who have since reversed their position, who felt that fracking and the cheap natural gas that fracking produced would be a bridge to a decarbonized future. They presented natural gas as a bridge fuel. Of course, since then, we've realized that methane leaks from fracking have really helped accelerate the climate crisis. So those groups have reversed their position. You still want me to name them?
Yeah.
Chelsea, why don't we go on to another question, just because I'm watching the clock again and I really want to get as many of the questions that people had here. Yep.
Ranjana, maybe you can put the names in the chat. I think people are always interested to hear who's on our side and who isn't, understanding that their positions haven't evolved. Thank you. We have another question for Dr. Epstein. Can you address the threats and harms of fracking to our water?
That's most of the threats depend on what area of the country you're in. If you're in Pennsylvania, in the Marcellus Shale, for example, a lot of threats come from discarded wastewater, uncleaned wastewater that is dumped into fields, into streams. And it's inadequately cleaned in the most part. And there have been fish kills and toxins. For people who live in Texas, wastewater is usually disposed of down deep wells, deep disposal wells, and they can be a danger. But we don't have the kind of stream contamination problems that are seen in Pennsylvania, except very rarely. Most of the problems with water have to do with people who get their water from well water. And folks who have, and there are more people who get water from wells, private wells, as opposed to city water supplies than people realize. Although it's not as widespread an issue as we originally feared. I think the biggest fear to public health comes from air because everybody breathes the air. But people who do have private wells and who get water that's contaminated from fracking waste and fracking accidents are at risk of health effects, predominantly from what they're drinking.
Thank you. Kelsey, I think we have time
Great.
for one or two more questions, depending on how complicated they are.
Great, thank you. We have a question. Is the air quality monitored in the neighborhoods in Arlington?
Ranjana, you wanna?
So the state of Texas has a air monitoring network, which is very scanty. So there are a couple of air monitors in this region, but they're not at the fence line. They are not close even to drill sites. And the Dallas-Fort Worth area has been in non-attainment of federal air quality standards for decades with regard to smog, ground level ozone. So the monitoring is highly, highly inadequate and sketchy. And when we have public hearings at City Council to permit this, the industry always says, well, there's air monitoring. But for all practical purposes, there isn't any that would actually pose limits on doing drilling that is actively causing emissions. In fact, I've gone out to a lot of these drill sites in Arlington with Earthworks, a national organization. They have a thermographer with a FLIR camera. And I have seen the worst emissions that were not visible to the naked eye, but that her camera could capture. And I have taken all of those videos to our city council, and they can see them, and they're horrified. But there's really no way to, say that anything is being monitored. The less you know, the easier it is to permit more wells.
Kelsey, let's try to fit in one more question. I see one here. I think you might be looking at it too, from Matthew Geyer on the setbacks question and the wellheads. Are you seeing that question?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Melissa. Yes, so the question is, are the setbacks based on the wellhead? With fracking, the horizontal distance of the well can be over a mile from the wellhead. So that's one, and then there's a second part, which is what about the potential for earthquakes? But maybe focus on the setback question in how they measure that. If you know the answer.
I can tell you how it's measured in Arlington. In Arlington, it is not measured from the fence line of the drill site. So they define something called a drill zone, which is the smallest polygon that you can draw around the hole through which they drill. And then the distance is measured from that drill zone to the fence line of the neighboring property. And we have a 600-foot setback, but the city council is allowed to waive it down to 300 with a majority vote. So sometimes you find people living 100 feet from the, from the boundary of the drill site, because the distance is not measured from the boundary, it's measured from the drill zone, which is the actual hole that you drill, your well through. So it's all designed to make it easier for industry to get closer and closer, despite the fact that they can drill from far away.
Kelsey, before we close out, I just want to follow up on one thing that we actually didn't kind of circle back to that I promised that we would, but I think it's really important to leave folks with. And that is that Texas does have a law, a state law, that was passed by a 4-to-1 margin in 2015 from the state that says that the kind of campaign and the kind of city council vote that Ranjana and her Liveable Arlington managed to get the city council in Arlington to do is actually illegal under state law, because cities do not have the right to say no to any oil or gas development within their boundaries. The state oversees all of it, and this law was passed a year after the city of Denton, Texas, in 2014, voted to ban all fracking within its city limits. And when that happened, the oil and gas industry went to the state and got the state, again, through a margin of 4-1 in a vote, to pass House Bill 40, which is still in play. So even though these tenacious women have gotten the city council to say no to these drilling sites, they don't know what the end result is going to be. The state could come in, they could charge the city with an illegal action and force the city to hire legal staff to defend it. So this story is not yet over. It's one that we wanted to tell to all of you because of the tenacity it took simply to do this in Texas, and what they have accomplished and the ways that they've organized, from Maria's work within her community, from Dr. Epstein coming into Arlington to educate community members about this, from Wanda Vincent agreeing finally to come and give a very emotional testimony about these children that she loves and cares for. They succeeded against all odds to do what no one else in Texas has been able to do. And I think that the strength and the persistence of their actions ought to speak volumes for what each of us can do. And each of us can start by finding someone we know in California and contacting them about the assembly bill. And let me be sure I get that number again. Does anyone have that bill number? I think it's 435 or something. Anyway.
It's 345.
Okay.
It's SB 345. I've got information about it in the chat.
Terrific. And anyone who wants can grab that Google link and send it on to anyone they know in California. It just needs one more vote and things could change there, just as they can be changed in any of your communities through the combination of the kind of campaign that these incredible women have put together. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you most of all for our guests from Texas, Ranjana and Anne and Maria and Wanda's words that were with us tonight. So thank you all for joining us. And if you have any questions, please just get in touch with me directly or with people at Mothers Out Front, and we'll certainly follow through as best we can. But for tonight, good night. And again, thank you so much for this. And we're going to be sharing this far and wide. Thank you so much. Good night.